Imagine you're given a singular task to dismantle a nation, not with bombs and not with bullets, but from the inside out. Now, where would you begin? First, you'd need to identify the pillars that hold any strong country together: energy security, industrial capacity, financial stability, social cohesion, cultural unity, sustainable demographics, food security, defensive capability, strategic independence, and sovereign identity. These aren't just metrics on a spreadsheet, they're the foundations that separate prosperous nations from failed states. Then you'd craft a precise, calculated program to weaken each pillar, one by one. A systemic strategy to strip away everything that allows a country to thrive or endure. You'd start with energy. If you wanted to cripple a nation's productive capability, you'd target its power supply first, make it expensive, make it unreliable. Above all, make abundant energy resources politically toxic. Take a resource-rich nation and instead of harnessing its wealth, export it at rock-bottom prices, sometimes without collecting a cent in return. Then force citizens to pay premium prices for unreliable alternatives. Make people pay third-world prices for first-world power by forcing them to buy back unreliable energy generators made from their own exported resources. Energy isn't just power, it's the lifeblood of industry. It's the backbone of quality of life. The more energy a nation harnesses per capita, the more advanced its economy becomes, the stronger its society. So you'd confuse them, convince the public that high energy use is selfish, even reckless, make them accept higher bills, believe that using less is somehow noble, call it progress, or better yet, a sacrifice they should adopt with pride. Destabilize energy and you destabilize manufacturing. You can't smelt aluminium with good intentions, and you can't power steel mills with empty promises. You can't run factories on fairy dust without cheap, reliable energy. The factories close, the businesses fold, or flee offshore. A nation that can once build anything, ships, steel, cars, now struggles to assemble the basics. Why? Because manufacturing needs three things to survive: cheap energy, reliable energy, and a certainty that both will be there tomorrow and a decade into the future. Destroy all three and you destroy the ability to produce anything more complex than a meat pie. As manufacturing dies, so do the industries and communities built around it. Once thriving towns are left with empty factories, deserted storefronts, decaying neighbourhoods. This isn't just the loss of jobs, it's the erasure of entire ways of life. People that once took pride in creating things are left to feel like relics in a world that no longer values them. But disintegration doesn't stop there. Next, you target social cohesion. Turn the housing market into a casino for foreign capital. Make housing so expensive that young couples abandon any thought of starting a family. Force multiple generations to live under one roof, not out of choice but out of necessity. Create a system so twisted that a child born today could spend a lifetime just saving for a deposit. While your population struggles to afford rent, you'd flood the country with permanent migrants, with thousands of new people each day competing for the same homes, the same jobs, and the same hospital beds. You create a system so perverse that doctors live in shared housing and nurses sleep in their cars. This is where the ripple effect begins. Young people leave, drawn to distant cities or other countries. Those who remain sink into economic despair. The very fabric of society begins to fray as the pathways to prosperity fade, unraveling the threads that hold communities together. And here's where it gets truly diabolical. You call it growth. Label anyone questioning this madness as a racist. Gaslight locals, telling them to lower their expectations, convince them it's selfish to want a fair chance at housing, education, or a dignified job. Import a person or two every minute while telling citizens to expect less. Pretend that the influx is useful. Call them students. Cook the books to count foreign students' rent as exports and call it wealth. Turn the education system into a visa factory. Tell them we need more migrants to build more houses for more migrants. Claim perpetual skills shortages. Tell them it's never enough. Demoralize the population by forcing them to compete with the world's poor for basic rentals while the world's rich buy up their homes. Watch the social fabric disintegrate as young families abandon dreams of children. Erase cultural touchstones, demolish community venues, churches, sporting fields, and cinemas. Anything that fosters connection, anything that embodies the spirit of mateship, replace them with apartments to house the incoming masses and call that progress. When they ask apartments for who exactly, gaslight them. Watch as the culture itself fades. Its music, its film, its arts become relics of another era. Strip people of a shared feeling of place and a feeling of identity. Make the public question their own reality, as they never belonged here in the first place. It was never their country. Make them feel out of the nation's flag, the nation's day, the nation's culture. Erode the nation's high trust society and convince neighbours to distrust each other. Put communities against one another. And once where there's easy camaraderie, you leave suspicion and resentment. A country where you could leave your doors unlocked, where kids play cricket in the street until dark, where you could catch the last train home without fear. where you'd stop to help a broken down motorist with a no worries mate, a place where mateship wasn't just a word, it was a backbone of who we are. Now we have terrorism warning signs at shopping centres, cameras on every corner, and parents afraid to let their kids to walk to school. Another deliberate pillar of our nation torn down. From a society built on trust and looking out for each other to one where fear and suspicion rule exactly as planned. But the disintegration doesn't stop there. Now you turn to political integrity. You foster an environment where the power serves the powerful. You let politicians make empty promises and ignore constituents and cater to the interests of corporations. When systemic corruption becomes the norm, people lose faith in those meant to represent them. Turn regulatory bodies into protection rackets for private growth, and when corruption becomes normal, people lose faith in democracy itself. Transform healthcare into chaos, stretch resources so thin that hospitals, surgeries and clinics can no longer meet the basic demand. Attack doctors and nurses that speak up or don't follow the official line. Encourage immigration without corresponding investment in healthcare infrastructure. Force citizens to wait for essential services, to tolerate overcrowded hospitals, to feel that their lives and health has been sidelined in the pursuit of economic growth. The physical and mental strain mounts as people realise that the safety net they once relied on is fraying beyond repair. Health crises grow unchecked, leaving people more susceptible to everything from stress to preventable diseases. Then turn to law and order. Without economic stability and social trust, crime rises. But in turning into solutions, you under-resource law enforcement, leaving them overwhelmed. Public safety becomes a commodity, and only the wealthy can afford the kind of security that was once right for all. This loss of basic safety eats away at the very idea of society where people look out for each other, where the law is equal for all. Instead, fear becomes the unspoken rule, further driving people into isolated self-protective bubbles. Finally, silence any resistance, manipulate data, conceal damage, create a ministry of propaganda, pass laws punishing dissent, force people to identify themselves online so you jail them for speaking up. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Manual for National Suicide. This is Australia in 2024. Now, let me tell you and show you exactly how they're doing it, because once you understand, this is not incompetence. This isn't mere mismanagement. This is a controlled demolition of the great nation of Australia. Energy, the foundation of any advanced economy. There's no such thing as a low-energy nation that isn't wealthy. Every leap in human progress, every advance in the quality of life has been built on accessing more energy, not less. History shows that every new energy discovery is additive. It doesn't replace. When we burn more wood today than we did when we discovered coal, and we burn more coal than when we discovered oil, and we burn more oil than we discovered gas and started burning gas, and burn more gas than we discovered nuclear. The nations with the highest economic consumption per capita are invariably the most advanced economies with the highest standards of living. We've been conned into believing that using less energy is somehow virtuous, that scarcity equals progress. This is a lie. The correlation between energy and prosperity isn't an accident, it's fundamental. More energy means more industrial capacity, more productivity, more wealth creation, more prosperity. When Britain led the world in coal consumption during the Industrial Revolution, it led the world in economic power. When America dominated oil consumption in the 20th century, it dominated the global economy. Today, nations like South Korea and Singapore pair massive energy consumption with massive economic output and soaring living standards. Every major economy in history has been exploited as energy advantages to power growth. Yet in Australia, we've been tricked into doing the opposite, giving away our energy advantage while deliberately hobbling our own industrial capacity. You see, a country with 1,200 years of coal resources, you would think we would be an energy superpower. You would think a country sitting on 31% of the world's uranium, twice anyone else, would be an energy superpower. You would think a country second in the world, sometimes first in the world, supplying 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas, would be an energy superpower. Yet here sits Australia, perched atop the world's largest low-cost energy reserves, while being gaslit into national poverty. We export our resources at rock-bottom prices while deliberately impoverishing ourselves, and we call it virtue. This engineered destruction spans all three of our energy advantages. Coal was Australia's largest export last year at 127 billion, generating probably about 20 billion in royalties and taxes. Yet we've banned new coal power plants domestically. The coal still gets burned, just in Chinese factories making products they sell back to us at premium prices. Instead of building modern ultra supercritical coal plants with 45 to 50% thermal efficiency to power an Australian manufacturing renaissance, we've chosen industrial suicide. The hypocrisy is breathtaking. We won't use coal for power generation at home. That would be environmentally irresponsible of us. Yet somehow it's virtuous to dig up coal on a scale that makes it our country's greatest export, ship it 7,500 kilometres to China on bulk carriers that can, depending on the fuel, emit as much sulphur in one carrier as Australia's entire car fleet, then let China burn it in its factories. The coal still gets burned, we just make sure we get none of it to our economic benefit. Australia has 31% of the world's uranium reserves, yet the politicians have banned it at both the state and the federal levels. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. We'll run a nuclear research reactor in downtown Sydney and buy nuclear submarines, but we won't use nuclear power to make Australia globally competitive. We're the only G20 nation that doesn't generate or import nuclear power, or have a plan to do so. Bangladesh has already built a nuclear generator, and it's commissioning one as we speak. To understand the scale of this sabotage, Australia has twice the share of global uranium reserves that Saudi Arabia has in oil reserves. While the Saudis built an empire, we're debating whether to use nuclear power at all. Nuclear provides the most reliable, high-density baseload power of any energy source. A single pellet of uranium fuel contains as much energy as a ton of coal. France gets 70% of its electricity from nuclear power, giving it some of the lowest energy prices in Europe. The energy advantage has made France the world's largest net electricity exporter, giving it over 3 billion euros per year while protecting its manufacturing base. Meanwhile, we sit on the world's largest uranium reserves, debating whether we should use them at all. Germany shows what happens when you destroy energy security. After shutting down the nuclear plants in a fit of green ideology, then losing Russian gas through a pipeline sabotage, Germany's industrial might is collapsing in the second straight year of recession, with the lowest industrial output in 10 years, ex-COVID. Tax revenues will fall 60 billion euros short over 5 years, leaving a 40 billion euro budget hole. BASF, Germany's chemical powerhouse, is shuttering 11 plants at its headquarters, the world's largest integrated chemical production site, and instead spending 10 billion building a super plant in China. Most devastating is the destruction of the Mittelstand, a 3.1 million small and medium-sized companies that make up 99.4% of German firms. Unlike global corporations that can flee the country, these businesses are taking the full brunt of Germany's energy crisis. Australia also sits on 20% of the world's thorium reserves, enough to power the entire world for 500 years, enough to make it an energy superpower. The next revolution in energy will be thorium-based small modular reactors. They're physically incapable of melting down. They can build in assembly lines like cars and actually consume nuclear waste as fuel. A single 100 megawatt thorium reactor needs just 36 kilograms of fuel per year, costing $1,800 to replace 613,000 metric tons of coal. But in Australia, we've chosen to be the world's quarry, operating at the lowest levels of the value chain possible, content to dig up radioactive dirt and ship directly overseas so other countries can capture the value. The story with gas is just as perverse. As the world's second largest LNG exporter, sometimes number one, we tell Australians they can't have gas stoves in new homes. Something climate change, something no, we ship our gas overseas so cheaply that half the gas we sell to Japan is on-sold to another country, and China resells an amount equal to a third of what Australia needs domestically. Before someone's fairy godmother blew up the Russian pipeline feeding Europe, Australia's east coast had the seventh highest gas prices globally. Now gas prices have doubled. We ship so much gas overseas and have no domestic reservation scheme. We're in the absurd position of building LNG import terminals while our energy market operator warns us we won't have enough gas to meet the winter demand. Australians pay $12.50 per gigajoule wholesale, and that's only because the government had to cap prices when they hit $50 back in 2023. Meanwhile, Americans pay a bit over $2, and Qataris even less. Speaking of Qatar, they're able to export about the same amount of LNG as Australia, but their citizens pay zero income tax, zero property tax, zero corporate income tax, get free healthcare, free education, subsidised housing and cheap energy. Here, 6 of our 10 LNG export facilities pay no Australian royalties at all to the Australian government. Australia also has a significant amount of shale oil reserves, about 24 billion barrels of recoverable oil equivalent, but state bans and other restrictions currently inhibit their exploitation. So what do the politicians crow about instead? That Australia could be a renewable energy superpower. Superpower of what exactly? Importing Chinese solar panels and windmills. Exporting hot air. More like an energy super idiot. After all, if you want any more proof that wind power can't be used to make wind turbines, Australia's last wind turbine manufacturer announced only a couple of weeks ago they were shutting down due to cheaper Chinese imports. With energy prices double or more compared to the US, Canada, India, and China, we can't make wind turbines anymore. The Australian wind farms that we do have are losing money and lose money hand over fist, which is about 38% of projects. showing they lose about $3 trillion over their lifetime compared to the capex and generation costs and realised price. With one staffer saying each wind turbine is subsidised by taxpayers between $600,000 and $900,000 per year, stripping $40 billion out of the economy in the form of higher energy prices. Addy Patterson, the former head of ANSTO, the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation, exposed the renewables fantasy. He said, wind blows in Australia about 37% of the time. That's 2 days out of 5 on average, and solar panels don't work at night. So when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining, which is 3 days out of 5, I'm not sure how we think we're going to create electricity that's low carbon. The long-term plan for AEMO is to have wind and solar generate 75% of our power with batteries. I don't see how you do that. The law of physics won't allow it. The published literature says it's not achievable. The literature does say that there's some sort of speculative stuff that shows it's very expensive, and modelling shows that once you're above 15 to 30% of the grid with intermittent renewables, the price goes up in an uncontrollable way. At a very minimum, we need 40 to 50% nuclear and probably closer to 80. And I don't know how many of you subscribe to Doomberg, but he published a piece this morning called, was it Blunder Down Under? Where he echoed this. He said, alas, as sure as night follows day, whenever renewable sources of energy penetrate a grid to any meaningful extent, skyrocketing prices and electricity shortages are sure to follow. No country, not even Australia, holds veto power over the laws of physics. The price explodes because you hit a wall at 30% of renewables. Too much power when you don't need it, and too little when you do, not enough when you do. Especially when the wind blows and the sun is shining, or both aren't. You either need to move energy through time with batteries or through space with transmission lines, and both cause costs to spiral exponentially. And where is Australia at? It's at 35%. In fact, this morning, Doomberg said in Power Down Blunder, the entirety of the country's struggles with its grid can be traced back to forcing the introduction of low-entropy parasitic renewables. Simply put, if something makes you sick, the first step is to stop eating it. Australia long ago reached diminishing incremental utility of new solar and wind facilities on the sunny or windy days when the grid goes overwhelmed and the power has power it doesn't need, having more capacity is counterproductive. However, it's worse than that. And I didn't know this actually until a little while ago when I listened to Addy Patterson on a podcast. Modern manufacturing can't run on unreliable power, but solar panels generate DC power, and so does wind, because when the turbines spin, they do so erratically. So that DC has to be converted into AC power, creating frequency problems and phase instability. The harmonics interfere with precision equipment. The electromagnetic interference causes issues with everything from CNC machines to medical equipment, and the voltage fluctuations affect servo motors. That's why industrial facilities either need reliable grid power or expensive filtering systems that make them uncompetitive. And Addy said that South Australia has already lost manufacturing because of this to the United States, not because it's unreliable, but because of the manufacturing issues with precision equipment. And he thinks that we'll be unable to maintain the AUKUS submarines in the state because of this. And take Cadbury's century-old Hobart factory for chocolate. The gas boilers will cost tens of millions of dollars to electrify at just one site. The high-temperature industrial heat needed for everything from feed processing to cement demands reliable baseload power. Cadbury's energy prices rose by more than a third in 5 years, while the gas prices doubled in 12 months. You can't make chocolate, let alone steel or chemicals, with solar panels and wind turbines. So with coal, uranium, thorium, shale oil and gas, you would think Australia would have the cheapest and most reliable energy in the world. You would think with all this low-cost energy, we would be a manufacturing superpower, a powerhouse, and this country a titan on the world stage. To have not one, not two, not three, but 5 energy resources that Australia is bountifully gifted, either banned outright or deliberately mismanaged, or beyond, or basically politically toxic. It's sabotage. But energy capability that has been sabotaged by politicians, the media, and bold institutions from institutions that we used to trust, and we should be able to trust. And the CSIRO, I'm looking at you because you knew exactly what you were doing. The circular stupidity is breathtaking. We sell our coal and gas at rock bottom prices to China, who use this cheap Australian energy to power factories making solar panels or wind turbines. We then buy these back at premium prices, subsidise the installation with taxpayer money, and congratulate ourselves on our environmental virtue, while our own manufacturing dies from unaffordable, unreliable power. Only last week, the New South Wales Premier told us to turn off our dishwashers and our washing machines or risk blackouts. And AEMO, the market energy operator, is using energy emergency powers to force businesses to cut power. Last week, they kicked 65 megawatts of business usage off the grid for an hour. Major data centers draw 300 to 400 megawatts. How can Australia harness an AI revolution when the data center operators are regularly told by EMO to switch to backup generators or you'll brown out Sydney and Melbourne? And in fact, one data center operator told me today that we will definitely brown out over this summer. They get regularly told to turn on the generators, and they get paid through the RT, and so it's actually a profit line on the data center's P&L, which is bizarre. This is not an energy transition, it's a wealth transfer. It's not an environmental virtue, it's economic vandalism. The politicians are sleepwalking this country into ruin. And as I said before, Australia should be the richest country in the world. And we used to be. In 1880, Melbourne and Buenos Aires were the richest cities in the world, both built on natural resources and commodities. Argentina then spent a century destroying its wealth through socialism, government mismanagement, corruption, and money printing. Does that sound familiar? Australia followed the path of capitalism. Now, as Argentina finally gets its act together, we're following the old path to ruin. A country blessed with more energy resources than almost any other, reduced to begging its citizens to turn off their appliances and stop watching Netflix or crash the grid. A nation that should have used its resource wealth to build a manufacturing powerhouse instead bans gas stoves while exporting enough gas power to power half of Asia. I don't know what it will take to wake everyone up to the scale of this collapse. Our manufacturing share of GDP is 5.39%. It's not just below the world's average, it's less than 1/3 of the world's average, on par with Equatorial Guinea, an economy so underdeveloped they do not have a single cinema. In 1970, our manufacturing share of GDP was 25%. For economic complexity, Harvard ranks us 93rd in the world, after Uganda and Armenia. A measure of how complex or sophisticated the things are we produce. Our economic complexity has dropped like a rock, down 38 places in 30 years. This isn't just a problem because we export as really dead trees and the gas from those trees. It makes us completely dependent on importing from other countries just about anything. If we went back 50 years, you would be amazed about the things this country made. We used to be a country that made things. We have practically no capacity to refine oil and rely upon imports to meet the vast majority of the demand for diesel, the fuel that makes our entire supply chain work. We import 90% of our liquid fuel through just 2 operational oil terminals, which only survive through federal government support and hold 50 days of fuel stock on the shore, well below the 90 minimum requirement. And half of that is diesel and half of that is petrol. We cannot make a commercial or passenger aircraft. Not only can we not make a car anymore, we can't even make a car tire. We only have 2 refineries that can make bitumen for the roads they drive on. We cannot make computers. We cannot make a mobile phone. We cannot make integrated circuits. We cannot make a refrigerator. We cannot make a light bulb anymore. We cannot make a razor blade. We're at the end of the road in producing plastics. 90% of our prescription medicines are imported. We cannot make Dunlop volleys. We no longer make reflex paper. We can't make enough saline. It's salt and water. We cannot make a tin can for baked beans anymore. What will it take for this country to wake up? Compare this to South Korea, where it's integral to their national identity and a matter of national pride for South Koreans to buy South Korean goods. Their trains run on Hyundai tracks, their roads are filled with Kia cars, and 70% of South Koreans use Samsung phones. In Australia, when our politicians refuse to be photographed with the Australian flag and our supermarkets refuse to stock merchandise for Australia Day, compare the two. Which one is an advanced, resilient economy, and which one is in the Stone Age? If Coles and Woolworths were asked to release the data on the country of origin for all of their product lines, including the home brands, the people of Australia would be shocked. What does it take to get this country, everyone in this country, to realise how serious things are? Australia is about to be a country that cannot make a chocolate bar. The deliberate destruction of Australia's energy advantage isn't just about making manufacturing impossible, it's about making everything unaffordable. When you're engineering the world's highest power prices in a country blessed with unlimited energy resources, you don't just kill industry, you create the perfect conditions for what comes next. After all, if you wanted to destroy a nation from within, you wouldn't just make it impossible to manufacture anything, you'd make it impossible for people to shelter and raise families. You'd transform housing from a basic human requirement into a weapon of mass impoverishment. And once there was a thing called the Great Australian Dream. Home ownership wasn't just about shelter. It was the foundation of a better life. The cornerstone of success and security in this country. That dream has now become a nightmare for the average person. It is mathematically impossible for the average Australian to buy the average house, not because of one's lack of talent, skill or ability, but because of mathematics. In Sydney, you can no longer buy a house with wages because in Sydney it now takes 46 years to save just the deposit. Not to pay off the house, just the deposit. Think about that. A child born in Sydney today, their retirement party will come before they've saved enough for a housing deposit. And that's assuming house prices stand still. They won't. By the time the child finishes their 46-month savings marathon, the finishing line will have another zero on the end. Now, urban planners say that the median house price to household income ratio of the median house price to household income is 3 or less. It's affordable. If it's 3.1 to 4, it's moderately unaffordable. It's 4.1 to 5. It's seriously unaffordable, and 5.1 or over is severely unaffordable. Sydney house prices are now at 13.8, more expensive than New York at 7, and Greater London at 8.1. San Francisco is 9.7. This is a city routinely mocked for its housing costs because the tech millionaires driving up prices, and it's actually far more affordable than Sydney. Sydney, a city with the manufacturing capability of Equatorial Guinea, has somehow engineered a housing crisis that costs more and it makes Silicon Valley look cheap. Indeed, Sydney, as of October, has the median house price of $1.65 million, requiring a $333,000 deposit, plus $73,502 in stamp duty for a total of $1.72 million. And why the government needs $73,000 to stamp a document in the mother of all housing crisis is beyond me. The monthly repayments will be $10,259 after tax for 20 years, and over $1 million of that is just interest being paid to the Commonwealth Bank. But this crisis is not natural, it's engineered. While Australia's struggle to afford rent, the government has flooded the country with the largest immigration wave in history, not by the hundreds, not by the thousands, but 737,000 in the year ending 30th of June 2023, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics. That's more than the combined populations of Canberra and Hobart, up an astonishing 73% on the year before, in a cost of living crisis. And you know in COVID, when all the international students went back home, only then, according to SGS Planning and Economics, did rents in Sydney become acceptable. Not affordable, but acceptable. So why in a cost of living crisis would they import a Canberra and a Hobart per year? Why in a cost of living crisis would they allow 969,230 international student enrollments in this country when we send 13,529 out? When you know there's only 6.9 million international students in the world that actually leave their country to go to study in another country. So why in a cost of living crisis would they cram 14% of the world's international student population into Australia? Why in a cost of living crisis would they let international students consume up to 24% of the rental market in some local government areas? Why in a cost of living crisis would they allow 2.46 million temporary visas into a country of 27 million when there's only 36,000 rental vacancies? Why are they bringing in so many people into the country that almost 17% of migrants are living in what the ABS calls crowded houses, where they don't have enough bedrooms for the people living there? Sometimes up to 20 people living in a 2-bedroom apartment. Sometimes where people are hotbedding by sharing a bed. Why would we subject migrants to this cost of living crisis, housing so expensive that 85% of them immediately go into rental stress? That is, outgoings greater than incomings. The highest demographic for stress tracked of all demographics by DFA analytics. Why, in a cost of living crisis, would immigration ramp so high that it now accounts for 42% of all service exports in this country, to become our supposed third largest export in 2023, up 79.8% to 47.8 billion per annum? Only it's a statistical trick, and that 47.8 billion export isn't recognized by Harvard University as an export. And we all know those students are not really students. They are here to work, and that 47.8 billion of money is used to pay for their so-called education and cost of living is mostly paid from working here. with at least 8 billion sucked out of the economy and sent overseas by digital remittances, because there's 2 billion coming in and 10 billion going out in the digital remittance market. Why, in a cost of living crisis, where they bring so many people in, that Yarra Capital reported in the Australian Financial Review that migrants are indeed taking not some, but all the new jobs that are being created, and that employment growth among non-migrant workers has dropped to essentially zero, as net migration is currently supplying 1.4 people for every job created. So not only is the current generation of Australians' ability to get into the housing market destroyed, but their job opportunities have been taken away as well. What sort of skills crisis do we have when the ANU, Australian National University, found that by far the largest category of new permanent residents are partners of immigrants in the skills stream, and the partners in the family stream, over 100,000 per annum, where no skill is tested whatsoever? What sort of skills crisis exactly do we have when 9.2% of the population are already on temporary visas and we still have a supposed skills crisis? What sort of skills crisis do we have exactly when there are literally no jobs available in Australia outside the NDIS and running the Ponzi itself? Now take a look at this chart. In the last 12 months to June 30th, there were 300,000 or so jobs created, or employment growth, in healthcare and social assistance, about 100-something thousand in administrative and support services, completely non-productive, public administration and safety, and everything else is backwards. Everything. If you remove healthcare and social assistance from employment growth in the last 12 months, there would be literally no job growth at all. There's no job creation in this country at all, outside the government bankrupting the country on $84 billion in disability support, a scam so rorted that somehow 12% of all 5 to 7-year-old boys are on NDIS. We're bringing in a Canberra and Hobart per year, 737,000 people for this. What sort of skills crisis exactly do we have? Where in 2020, Jobs and Skills Australia reported that every job vacancy attracted 14 applicants on average, 7 of which were deemed unsuitable. And last year, 24 applicants on average, with 17 deemed unsuitable. So every new job applicant applying goes into the unsuitable pile. Every single one of them. What sort of skills crisis do we have exactly where Jobs and Skills Australia found that every single job seeker we're bringing in at this point just adds to the mountain of unqualified candidates? What sort of skills crisis do we have when 7% of the so-called migrants, skilled migrants, are on unemployment benefits paid for by the Australian taxpayer? When almost 11% of all migrants, no matter what year they're brought in, are on unemployment benefits? What sort of skills crisis do we have when 9.2% of NDIS recipients are migrants, with SBS saying the number should be 20%? What sort of skills crisis do we have when 18% of migrants coming in don't even speak English? Where 20% of skilled migrants don't pay any personal income tax? Where 30% of all migrants don't pay any personal income tax? What sort of skills crisis do we have when the Australian National University found that only about 1/3 of permanent new migrants are selected even partly for their skills? Only 1/3 of permanent new migrants are selected even partly for their skills. We're not importing skills to solve a skills crisis. We're mass importing a skills crisis, a cost of living crisis, and a social and cultural catastrophe. Now you have to ask yourself, why? Every week, another community landmark falls to developers' wrecking ball. Every month, another nightlife precinct, theatre, church, cinema, racetrack, hall, or museum makes way for yet another apartment block. And it's not for you, and it's not for your children. It's for this. Why? You have to ask yourself, why would they punch the price of Australian housing to the moon? Where a non-beachfront penthouse in Bondi sells for the same price as a 525-foot, 1,400 guest, 480 lux stateroom cruise ship with an onboard casino. And if you want a 2025 model, I found a smaller one. Where the non-beachside penthouse sold for more than a 30,000 deadweight ton cargo ship, a 2022 Jet Ranger X, a 2022 McLaren 720S, a 21 G-Wagon, a 67 330 GTC, years 7 to 12 of Askham and Cranbrook school fees, and a 14-bedroom, 6-bathroom country house in the south of France. Why would they create a cost of living crisis so bad that essential workers cannot afford to live anywhere where they work? Why would they create a cost of living crisis so bad that our elderly are choosing between heating and eating? Why would they create a cost of living crisis so bad that people on job seeker cannot afford to live? Why would they create a cost of living crisis so bad that hospitality workers cannot afford to live? While Australian renters are competing with the world's poorest who sleep in bunk beds, balconies, or tents, Australian first home buyers are stuck on a treadmill trying to save for a deposit, competing with the world's wealthy in a casino for foreign capital in what Transparency International rates the worst money laundering property market in the world. There's a charade of supposed restrictions on overseas buyers, but I don't know if you know this, but Chinese citizens are prohibited from sending more than $50,000 a year overseas, US. And they're also prohibited from owning property outside of China. In fact, immigration is the only legal way for Chinese to own property abroad, full stop. Literally full stop. To buy an existing home, real estate agents boast that foreign buyers simply make demolition of the existing structure a condition of sale. Or someone of their kids or nephews pretend to be one of the almost 1 million students who, funny enough, are able to buy property while being a student, then they themselves come across as either a parent of that student or via a family reunification visa, for which we do not test skills, down the track. And almost a quarter of those, So no wonder home ownership has collapsed 30% amongst 24 to 35-year-old Australians, the prime for starting families, since the 1980s. The Great Australian Dream has become the Great Australian Scream. And I wrote an essay on that if you want to read it. It's online. We used to talk about getting a fair go in this country, the idea that everyone deserves a fair chance, that if you work hard, you'll get ahead. That expression, like the dream it represented, has been deliberately destroyed. The Greens figured out that the lowest income where you could afford a house in the major city in Australia was Perth, where you need $140,000. And the highest is Sydney, where you need $293,000. The problem is brutally simple. The median household income in Australia is $121,000. Unsurprisingly, the net investment yield of stratospheric Australian property is negative in many areas. And this is Sydney. You can see where the negative is, and this is Melbourne. Our children will never believe there was a time where a single income could buy a home. Now both parents must toil away just to have a roof over their heads, which unsurprisingly, further tanks our already plummeting birth rate. At this rate, you'll have to send the kids off to the coal mines to keep your mortgage afloat. Cramping Australians into dog boxes above railway lines and forcing both parents to grind endlessly just to cover the rent isn't going to do wonders for our fertility rate. We're sitting at 1.5 and dropping like a rock, and we haven't been above 2.1, which is the rate we need to sustain the population. So every female in this country needs to have 2.1 children to maintain the population. We have not been above that rate since 1976. It's 50 years. Australians can't afford to have kids anymore, and certainly no longer have the appropriate housing conducive to having a family. This is the destruction of the Australian family unit. Do you know what the birth rate in this country being well below the replacement rate for 50 years means? Do you know actually how many net new houses we actually need to build in this country for Australians to live? Has anyone actually thought about that? We're a nation so obsessed with property that when Kourtney Kardashian sets foot in Australia, the first question is, what does it mean for Australian property? Trump wins an election on the other side of the world. What does it mean for Australian property? Do you know how many net new houses Australians need? I'll tell you the number, because they've been lying to you all along. 0. Yeah, 0. The tulip bulb mania that has pumped a real estate bubble to the moon in this country, wrecked the Australian standard of living, led to significant deterioration in the Australian way of life, swung the wrecker's ball through enough of Australian society and culture entirely, and let me be clear, is 100% due to an unhinged, uncalibrated, and totally out of control mass immigration program. This housing insanity is entirely the result of importing 1.4 new people into the country every minute of the day. That's 2,020 people every 24 hours, competing for the same homes, the same hospital beds, the same infrastructure. They've created a system so perverse that doctors live in shared housing and nurses sleep in their cars, a nation where young families compete with 100 international students for a single bedroom rental. And guess what? Turns out if you import a Canberra and Hobart every year, you actually need to build a Canberra and Hobart every year. And they kind of forgot about things like, I don't know, a city where people actually want to live, having enough water, hospital beds, so a strong victim, a stroke victim, it doesn't have to wait 4 hours in an emergency department chair, as they did here in the Northern Beaches only just recently. Or paying the police, ambos, and teachers a decent wage, trying to live in this hellhole of a cost of living crisis they're creating. They tell us we need more migrants to build houses for more migrants who will need to build more houses. Well, in a way that's true, because the houses that are being built are almost entirely for migrants, not for Australians. And if this sounds like a Ponzi scheme, it's because it is. For every 100 migrants, we need 40 homes. But of that 100, 39 are students, only 30 are even partly skilled, 18 don't speak English and couldn't pass the basic OH&S on a building site, 14 are parents, partners, or family reunification, of which a quarter don't speak English. We end up with 2.8 migrant tradies who work in construction, who may or may not build homes, but are somehow supposed to build 40 homes to the other 97. The proposition that we can import more migrants to build the homes that are needed by all these migrants is absolutely ludicrous. And guess what? The construction sector lost 55,000 jobs last year. This isn't a housing solution, it's a Muppet show, and we're paying for the tickets. No, the problem isn't negative gearing, it's not capital gains tax, and it's certainly not as a Reserve Bank governor tried to gaslight us, the choices we made as a society about where we want to live or how we want to invest in transport. It's entirely due to immigration, exactly as the same is in Canada. Behold Australia, behold Canada. The same pattern, the same policy, the same manufactured crisis. Why are they doing this? Why are they putting 77% of Australians that rent in rental stress and 50% of Australians with mortgages in mortgage stress, which is defined as outgoings greater than incomings according to DFA analytics. I don't know if you know this, but 84% of New South Wales renters are in rental stress. 84%. 60% of Tasmanian mortgage holders are in mortgage stress. Why? Why are Australians forced to live in tents? Why are the politicians driving Australia to the wall? Why have they turned the country into a circus of property propaganda? Why does the Bloc turn housing speculation into primetime entertainment? Why do our media companies masquerading as news organisations pump out reckless propaganda day in, day out, telling our people to gear themselves up to their eyeballs in articles like "Garbage Train Driver Reveals $12 million Property Portfolio While Earning Less Than McDonald's Workers"? Oh, you want to protect under-16s from social media, do you? Who's protecting under-16s from the Herald Sun promoting OnlyFans as the path for home ownership? Who's protecting under-16s from realestate.com.au, a $33 billion ASX-listed company telling under-16s that stripping online is the solution to a housing crisis? Just as the Weimar Republic's moral decay preceded its economic collapse, we've reached the point where major institutions celebrate degradation as the answer to affordability. This period will be studied in the future history books, not just for the economic madness and destruction of Australian society, but for the shameful complicity of every institution that normalised it. It's Peter Dutton. Our media companies, our banks, our politicians are all cheerleading young Australians towards debt slavery or degradation while calling it success. Why are they doing this? Why are they all complicit with this political master plan? Well, they're complicit with the political master plan, and I'll tell you about the political master plan in a second, but they're complicit with the master plan because everybody is in on the Ponzi. Let's start with the banks. Australian banks essentially have one product, residential mortgages. Have you tried borrowing from a bank to start a business? With Australian households already ranking second globally for debt at 110% at GDP, and up there with household debt to income, they've maxed out what locals can borrow. Yet somehow the Commonwealth Bank has a larger market cap than the biggest Indian bank, the biggest Japanese, the biggest Swiss, the biggest Saudi Arabian, the biggest Singaporean, the biggest Spanish, the biggest Italian, the biggest Brazilian, the biggest French, and Dutch banks. And sometimes it's bigger than Goldman Sachs. How do you maintain that without growth? Simply, you need to import more people. But do you know what actually happens when you issue all those home loans? Has anyone actually thought about what actually happens? When banks issue home loans, they create money. That's because banks don't lend out physical cash, but they instead create a deposit in the borrower's account. This is called money creation or credit creation. And the M1 money supply includes currency in circulation and demand deposits or current accounts that are used for transactions. When a bank issues a home loan, that deposit gets created, i.e. the loan amount, and increases the amount of money that these transaction accounts have, which directly contributes to an increase in the M1 money supply. Essentially, the loan amount becomes part of the money available for spending and for transactions. The Australian government provided about $164 billion of direct COVID stimulus with economic support payments, coronavirus supplements, and JobKeeper during COVID. But from July 2019 to June 2024, the total outstanding size of Australia's registered mortgage market increased from 1.7 trillion to 2.26 trillion, which is an increase of 600 billion. That $600 billion adds to the money supply. And think about it. Someone comes into the country, they get a home loan from the bank. That money is then created out of thin air. It's given to someone who sells their house, ends up circulating in the system, bidding up the price of everything. And I would argue that the money creation resulted from home loan issuance is a result of Australia's out-of-control mass immigration program, driving the mother of all housing bubbles and is directly causing generalised inflation. This, combined with our out-of-control land and energy prices, had led to Australia having the greatest fall in disposable income in the world. And we're down negative 8% in real household disposable income per capita since March 2022, while the rest of the OECD is up. You're not a genius for investing in Australian property. The currency has just been devalued from government spending, a mindless immigration program, and a mismanaged energy policy. Welcome to Project Zimbabwe, where everyone's a millionaire, just not how you expected. Where the only thing going well in Project Zimbabwe is the machete market. Instead of Australian property in the last 15 years, you'll be better off just putting it into pet rock, which is the true hedge against inflation. That's up 8.1% in the last 15 years, while SQM research says that Australian property is up 6.4 in 10 years per year, compound. Any guesses for when immigration in this country really started to ramp the mother of all housing bubbles? This is the price of gold. I think you can see when immigration started to ramp up a bit and then when it went crazy. So all the banks are in on the Ponzi, and the property industry, of course, they're in on the Ponzi, and construction is all in on the Ponzi, and Woolies and Coles know Australians can only eat so much and can only stomach so many price hikes. Their solution? Import more people. Retail, they're in on the Ponzi. Qantas and transport, well, you need more tourists or you need more import more people. Utilities, all in the Ponzi. And all of a sudden it makes sense, doesn't it? Why our supermarkets celebrate Diwali and Eid, but won't touch Australia Day. Why Qantas runs Welcome to Country on every flight and replaces city names with Aboriginal words on their boards. Ask yourself, why would the government and corporate Australia have such a vested interest in making Australians feel like they don't belong in their own country? Conditioned perhaps to feel a little bit racist if they complain about an out-of-control immigration program? And you know, Albanese in Prime Minister and Cabinet has a nudge unit. There's a thing called Beta, which is actually a behavioural economics unit, which is designed to nudge you into thinking certain things through manipulation of the message. I mean, did any real Aborigines ask Qantas to change the departure board? What next? I'll tell you what next. The government's now renaming Australian landmarks after Indian things. And this is just, I saw this the other day, I was like, wow. To wit, in Victoria, Berwick Springs Lake, without any community consultation, has now been renamed Guru Nanak Lake. Guru Nanak Lake. No, I'm not joking, and this is not candid camera. They named it after an Indian dude from 800 years ago that's never been to Australia, because Australia wasn't founded, nor has any connection whatsoever. It's like going to India and, I don't know, saying, let's rename the Ganges Donald Bradman River. Jacinta Ardern called anyone that opposes this a neo-Nazi that supported division and hate in Parliament. The over-the-top vitriol against a reasonable reaction to a ridiculous rename is a bit of a tell that something else is going on. And I shall get to that in a moment. A lot of the nonsense is coming from the super funds who are definitely all in the Ponzi. I can tell you a funny story about that after. Every month, 11.5% of the Australian wage bill goes into super, soon to be 12%. And where does it go? 8% goes directly into property, 23% goes into Australian stocks, of which 30% of the ASX 200 are the banks. Every month, that's billions of dollars bidding up the very systems looking Australians out of housing. Then there's the media. Nine Entertainment, owner of the Sydney Morning Herald, and The Age is really just Domain's journalism department. Their real estate portal makes up most of Nine's market value. No wonder they pump out endless property porn and immigrant success stories, or both combined, while burying the real crisis. Our universities, they've transformed from centres of learning into visa factories with 14%, that's kind of weird, isn't it? 14% of the world's international students. They're not great students. They're not from Harvard or Stanford or Oxford or Cambridge, or even IIT, which is the hardest university in the world to get into, the Indian Institute of Technology, where I think it's like 1 million students compete every year for a place. We're not getting them. We're getting 14% of the world's international students crammed into a country of 27 million. They're not selling education, they're selling immigration with a side of online lectures. This isn't conspiracy, it's a big business. Every major industry in this country is addicted to the population growth because they built their entire business model around it, except one industry, mining. And mining is completely vilified. The one industry that keeps the nation afloat is vilified. The one industry that provides the materials to build this very building we're sitting in, the steel, the copper wiring, the aluminum window frames, even the concrete itself comes from mining. Economic sabotage. We should do a lot more with the stuff we dig out of the ground, sure, and I've talked about this for years, right? We should elaborately transform the things we dig out of the ground into higher-end materials and so forth, and products and services, or products. But when the input costs of land, labor, and energy are sky high, how can you possibly build processing plants or factories? When the government stops a $1 billion gold mine because some random says the location might be the path of some Aboriginal songline, a songline which the local Aboriginal council in Orange says doesn't exist, who in their right mind would invest in manufacturing anything here? Mostly everyone's going along with it because in this country, 1/3 of people own their own home outright, so they've been happy. 1/3 have a mortgage, so they've been happy they bought earlier. And now 1/3 are hanging on for dear life. Everyone's in on the Ponzi, even the politicians that aren't driving the agenda. And there's a lot of red on that graph I've noticed, which is a bit weird. But you have to wonder why exactly at this point, when things are getting so bad, that Albanese continues to put Australians last. Even Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, who ran the identical policy playbook for this matter, had finally read the room. In a sheer panic, he's now proposing net zero immigration for 3 years. As the top commentator on YouTube of this policy announcement put it, this is like someone who sets fire to everyone's house on the street, sits them down for a serious conversation on fire safety. Because the polls show his party won't just lose the next election, they'll be obliterated. With concerns of the economy, housing market, and immigration, Trudeau's party will lose so many seats it may not even be the opposition party. In fact, Bloc Québécois, the Quebec separatist party, might be. In fact, Trudeau's party is polling so badly it possibly might end up 4th. Last week, even Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, started to panic over immigration. And he said, it was actually quite a very interesting speech. I'll just read out a bit of it. The Independent Office of National Statistics conducted vital work in the state of immigration and found the previous government was running an open borders experiment. And nearly 1 million people came into Britain the year ending June 2024. That is 4 times the migration level compared to 2019. Time again, they promised they'd get the numbers down. Time and time again, they failed. And now the chorus of excuses have begun. But what we didn't hear, what the British people are owed, is an explanation. Because a failure on this scale isn't just bad luck, it isn't just a global trend or taking your eye off the ball. No, there's a different order of failure. This happened by design, not by accident. Policies were reformed deliberately to liberalise immigration. Well, that's unforgivable, and mark my words, this government will turn the page. This begins in the economy, because you cannot separate the failure from the refusal to the hard yard of skills, welfare reform, or giving up on our young people's opportunities. Rather, the easy answers of looking overseas. He read the room, but only after 3 million people signed the petition for him to be recalled after 4 months of being voted in. So why does Albo continue to flood the country with a Canberra and a Hobart per year of immigrants? Why, when the numbers of immigrants already in the country are so high, there are LGAs where over 90% of the people are foreign born? Why would he do this? I decided to look into this with a statistician from Ireland who noticed a similar thing going on in his country. Brian Byrne, who worked with me, is from Burning Analytics. Previously did a demographic and labour market modelling and forecasting of the supply side for the Naval Shipbuilding College. Brian has a master's degree in geocomputation and spent 7 years in the police force and was a member of the Australian Defence Force in the Army. The data I'm about to show you comes through the Australian Bureau of Statistics, Census, General Community Profiles Data Pack, and I've given a link in an article. Go online if you want to download it and play with it. It's mapped to statistical area level 1, which provides the best available resolution. A calculation is performed to provide a % Australian born in each area. Unstated unknown is not included in the calculation, and that group is expected to bias towards non-Australians. There are limits to the data. The census captures all people, including tourists, and this shows around airports due to aircrew and airport hotels, etc. So let's see what the data says, shall we? I'm going to go to a thing which I've given a link to, which I'll put online, and people can play with it themselves. Okay, so this is a map of Sydney. I'm going to turn a few layers off now. Now, what I'm going to turn on is directly from the census data. And this is the percent of Australians born in each statistical area. So the dark green is 90% Australian born in that area. And the dark red is 90% foreign born in that area. And yes, we do have, the immigration program has been running so high, we have areas like this in Australia. For example, if I kind of zoom into down here and around the Haymarket area, I could give you an example of just one of the areas. I was at South Haymarket. I'll scroll down. 12% Australian born in that particular little block there, on that thing there. Okay, so we'll zoom back out again. And many areas in places like Fairfield, Strathfield, Ashfield, Campsie, Burwood, Homebush, range between 10% Australian born and 20% Australian born, which is pretty wild. Okay. Now, when you overlay this, and this is where it starts getting interesting, I'm going to overlay this with the 2022 federal election polling results. Oops. Okay. Just load up in a second. You can see, and it's pretty high correlation. Oops, let me zoom out. Still on my laptop. You can see in pretty high correlation that anywhere you've got very, very high densities of foreign born, they vote Labor. Anywhere you don't, they vote Liberal. And in fact, it's pretty high correlation. Let me just look down here at this line where you've got very, very high numbers of foreign born, and it just, it's like a red line. And the second you go out of that, it's a blue line of dots, right? And this holds true across Melbourne, holds true across Sydney, etc., and so forth. It's pretty eye-opening. Now, when you overlay this with the federal election results, this is what you get. Now, Chris Minns has imposed new 5-year housing completion targets across New South Wales. 43 council areas from Greater Sydney to Newcastle must build to quota. As I understand it, must build to quota. And there's one sweeping target for the whole of regional New South Wales. Now, note, this is not a housing plan for Australians, it's a housing plan for new migrants. Australians are not having kids, and the housing construction is not needed anywhere near on the scale for locals who only require a knockdown or rebuild here and there, because we're having 1.5 children for every woman in the country. Now, Australia is divided into 151 electorates, and each is represented by one member of parliament. Under the Constitution, each existing state is guaranteed at least 5 members, but all states except Tasmania now have more. The numbers depending on their population. States may gain or lose members as a consequence of population movements. And as of April 2022, there was an average of approximately 117,163 enrolled electors per electorate. Now, a smart journalist from the Australian Financial Review, Campbell Kwan, cottoned on a little bit that something was going on, but didn't go very deep in the analysis. When you overlay the ABS data with the data from the Australian Financial Review, which they dug out in terms of which areas had the greatest changes in New South Wales housing targets per year, you did find that the greatest density rises in the Minns housing plan are all in Liberal seats. So, in this electorate, it's 97% increase in housing targets, for example. And then up around Betrayal and so forth, 174%, and so on. These are pretty high numbers, actually. If you look at the numbers that Minns has actually put out there, they're really high numbers. In fact, the number of immigrants coming in are so high that some LGAs are receiving so many people that it's over 40%, 50%, or in the case of the Hills District, 60% of the size of a federal voting electorate. Now, where are those people coming from that are going into these electorates? Well, they're certainly not coming from interstate, for example, in New South Wales, because we're losing people interstate. New South Wales residents are primarily fleeing hand over fist to other locations, being Queensland. The annual interstate arrivals in New South Wales is less than 1 month's immigration to the country in some months. So we've got 81,655 coming interstate into New South Wales, for example, 31,000 net out in a year. But in the country as a whole, in February in 2024, 105,000 came to the country in a month, right? So that compares to the 81,000 in a year. So, it's very, 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 very big numbers coming in. Now, many probably won't realize it, but the demographics of Australia's population and immigration system have changed dramatically in the last few years. The Chinese have stopped coming in. And in fact, the top migrant country is now India, and they're coming in at an accelerated rate. So the occupiers of these new homes being built by Mins in the 5-year housing plan will mainly be from overseas. And at this point, if you look at the data, it's mainly from India. Now, I'm going to look at one of the LGAs. So the Hills LGA, for example, in northern Sydney has 66,450 homes in it. Under Mins' new plan, they're going to add 23,300 more within 5 years. And as I understand it, this is mandated. You have to build 23,000 homes. The average home there holds 3.1 people. They'll helpfully put it on their website. So they'll add 72,230 people into that LGA. That's about 60% of the voting power of one electorate being dumped into a single LGA. Now, Northwest Sydney overlaps 2 electorates. Mitchell, held by the Liberal National Party with a margin of 10.5% after the last electoral redistribution, and Berowra, which is also held by the LNP with a 7.5% margin. So that's a lot of change, having that number of people come in, 72,000 new people coming in 5 years into those electorates. Remembering, these electorates all have approximately the same number of voters, 117,000 in them. So it's coming into, so that LGA is over 2 electorates. It's 117,000 per electorate, and it doesn't really match up properly. But these are margins of about 12,000 and 9,000 votes, respectively, on those 2 electorates. Also remember that after the latest Australian Electoral Commission redistribution, the margin to the LNP across pretty much every single seat has been eroded by a little bit, according to Tally Room. I've got the data for that. I've got the link to the Tally Room article, but everything just eroded just a little bit. The build-out in the Hills LGA of 72,230 new residents, of which most will be migrants, increases the number of residents and therefore voters by a similar age distribution, assuming a similar age distribution and of those residents once they become ultimately eligible to vote. So it's obviously it's about a 4 or 5 year process to do so. And so in 5 years, we're going to have 72,000 new residents in the Hills LGA, and new migrants become eligible for residence requirements on conferral citizenship in 4 years, bestowing the right to vote. Now, new migrants don't vote in a coin flip. And the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, for example, found in a survey that Indian Australians, in the Indo-Australian voters in the 2022 general election, the Indian migrants vote 58-34 on a 2-party preferred basis for the LP. Now, the Hills District, at the moment, has 40.4% foreign-born, which is about the same level as London, which is the highest region in the entire of the United Kingdom. They're going pretty crazy over there about that. As of 2021, the top nationality for being a foreign-born in the Hills District was India, 12,577 people, up 120% from 5,703 in 2016. That's 17% compound growth per year over those 5 years. The Chinese population is growing, but only 8.8% compound per year. And that's changed also at the national level. I've pointed out that that's basically flatlined now. And the British and New Zealand population are not growing at all, or they're slightly dipping in some circumstances. Now, for completeness, the Chinese Australians also prefer to vote for the Labor Party. In fact, Tally Room found in the last election almost all areas that had an ethnicity of greater than 10% Chinese swung to Labor quite heavily, almost entirely. And in fact, you can look at the graphs and break it down to the SA1 level. And that's actually by the Tally Room. I didn't do this. The Tally Room did this online. So you can now see why the Australian Bureau of Statistics wants to hide ethnicity data from the census. Like all Australian public institutions, they're completely captured. Now, there might be a few uncomfortable truths to the Australian public about what's really going on here. Should, for example, the new homeowners in the Hills District, of which there's 72,000 of them, vote the same as new migrants from India, as they're likely the majority from overseas and like to be the majority of that segment. And remember, the percentage of Australians in that LGA has been decreasing. And vote with the same pattern as the Carnegie Foundation reported, it will be no surprise that a 34.7% increase in population in a single LGA, which sits across 2 electorates that encompass about the same number of people collectively as the LGA, held with a 7.5% and 10.5% margin, with voters voting 58-34 on a 2-party preferred basis, that these 2 electorates will now go from a dark blue for the LNP to a dark red voting for the ALP. Now, should the Liberal Party be concerned, you should be terrified, because Mitchell and Barara are the safest Liberal seats in the entire 43 LGA planned for Chris Minns. And unless the incoming demographics change massively, the numbers are so great they could stay red forever. The Liberal Party is finished if you don't wake up, and so will the Australian way of life. Australians can't afford to have families. The birth rate is collapsing, and even something as simple as backyard cricket or barbecue is now impossible in most new developments, where the backyard has shrunk to the size of a postage stamp or vanished entirely. I was invited to speak here today at Northern Beaches, so I thought I'd take a look at one of your electorates. In your LGA, the Northern Beaches, Minns is targeting 5,900 homes, for which a start is a pretty strange number. Why wouldn't it be 6,000? It's a bit odd. With 104,800 homes already and 267,921 residents, with an average of 2.6 people per average household size, this increases the number of residents by 5.7%. If those new residents vote 60-40 a certain way, that would swing the vote by 3.4%. With the Northern Beaches LGA and you've got the federal electorate of Mackellar. It's currently held by Teal with a 3,866 vote margin over the Liberal candidate, which after a recent AEC redistribution is a margin of, wait for it, 3.3%. Odd. Running the calculation in a very rough way, and this is very rough, across all 43 LGAs in the 5-year housing plan, and assuming a 58% two-party preferred federal voting intention, and assuming ultimately those migrants become citizens, I could only find one LGA that would stay blue, and that's Hornsby. And this is all online. You can look at it yourself and verify it and download the data packs. We didn't have the time to exactly match up the ABS data to the exact federal electorate boundary, so there's a flaw in this analysis. But I'm pretty sure after this speech, quite a few people will. All you have to do is use basic intuition. Every federal electorate has 117,000 people in it. We bring in 737,000 people like we did last year. That's 6 electorates of voters. In an electoral cycle, and a current rate, that's 18 electorates of people, potential voters, coming in the future. Australian federal electorates are held on slim margins mostly, 10% or under. Now, if those recent citizens vote even just say 60-40 in one way or another, and hypothetically you're good enough to spread them around, I don't know, by something like a forced 5-year housing density program, ironically a deadline that's roughly the time it takes for someone coming in now to get citizenship, with very precise housing targets per year that are forced, is my understanding, and precision locations to put that density, I don't know, like 200,000 homes over very specific train lines or metro stations, you would have the power to maybe tip 36 electorates in the first year that will become eligible to vote. Now, didn't anyone think it was a little bit funny that have a state government force a highly targeted housing density plan with precision numbers allocated by suburb? Something that's usually prerogative of the local government area and the council. Did anyone check the numbers and see they were stupidly high with up to 72,000 people being dumped into one LGA, which is 60% of the entire voting electorate? Did anyone click onto why all this was rushed and presented as an emergency? Did anyone think it was a bit funny for the government to push cookie cutter design so developers could push houses out quickly? Did anyone question the urban hellscape that was being created? And what do you think is going to happen when these new migrant kids grow up in these concentration camp suburbs? Didn't anyone click onto why this was totally out of character and heritage and low density areas were allowed to be bulldozed under this plan? I mean, 45-story apartment buildings in Gordon, 400 metres from the railway line, in an area that hasn't been under any controversy whatsoever, has it? Apartment blocks 45 stories high near the train station in Gordon would be totally in character for the area. Wow, and it's funny how they keep finding more capacity than originally expected for new homes in these transport-oriented developments called TODs. And only on Sunday, last week, we now have accelerated TODs, where you can build up to 6-story apartment blocks 1.2 kilometres from these metro railway stations, regardless of whether the land is in a heritage conservation area or zoned for low density. And Minns and Scully, the planning minister, hope that developers will start on those new homes very quickly. They've put in Bankstown, Bella Vista, Crow's Nest, Homebush, Hornsville, Kellyville, and Macquarie Park the ability within 1,200 metres of a metro or railway station to build 6 stories up and ignore heritage, is what it says, at least in this article. Kellyville's up here. Bella Vista is also in the blue area. Crow's Nest is down here where the blue dips into the what have you. Hornsby, right, etc. and so forth. So they're kind of interesting locations to have these accelerated TODs with super high density. So this is what Crow's Nest looks like now. And this is the proposal for Crow's Nest for housing new migrants. It's like an atom bomb is hit, and we will all be the casualties. And by the way, the 1.2 kilometre radius from Crow's Nest goes all the way to Victoria Cross in North Sydney. So that whole area is going to be like that. Nobody will distribute these new migrants perfectly, but look at the Australian federal election, which happens every 3 years. There's been almost a 45-seat difference since 1998. The playbook's California, which used to be a red state. The Republicans won 8 of the 9 presidential elections in the mid-1900s. In 1986, Ronald Reagan signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which legalized 2.9 million undocumented migrants. Shortly thereafter, in 1994, almost 2/3 of Californians voted to stop mass migration to their state and kick illegals off welfare. The proposition was overturned by a Democratic judge. California turned to a one-party blue state and never voted Republican ever again. Right? That's the playbook. Could inspiration possibly happen from California, be in the realm of possibilities? Well, step back and face the uncomfortable truth. We're bringing in a Canberra plus a Hobart worth of people every year, mostly India from the stage. And what jobs exist for them? Because either wiping bumps the NDIS, a workforce with a 17 to 25% turnover rate, because most aren't qualified or suited for healthcare work, or helping run they've got to work in the Ponzi itself, helping the immigration program bring in more people. That's about it. So they either work in education, those colleges jammed into buildings where there's 20 in a building, migration agents, migration lawyers, etc. And migration agents actually is on the job, the on list for migration. So we're bringing in migration agents to bring in more people. So that's weird. Jobs and Skills Australia own data tells the story. Every single job applicant is marked as being marked not suitable. Most of them not qualified, not suitable that comes in. They're just piling up. And according to Yarra Capital, there is absolutely zero employment growth for Australians. So really, is that what we're doing? You know, because prior to being elected, Albanese said that 160,000 new migrants a year was too many. He said, and I quote, I also know immigration, in brackets, shouldn't be a substitute for training Australian workers for Australian jobs. He added, we should not be a country where Australian workers are cut off from job opportunities. This is the greatest betrayal in Australian history. And for what has been done, cannot easily be undone. Australian society, culture, history, freedom, and wealth are being wiped from the planet Earth. And Australians are screaming for it to stop. Now they also want to steal Australia's future by commandeering the Future Fund, changing its mandate to deliver at least 4 to 5, from delivering at least 4 to 5% above the inflation rate, to now investing in overpriced houses, a catch-up in infrastructure to deal with Canberra and Hobart coming in every year, and unreliable energy projects. I would have thought it was a case of Hanlon's razor that never attributed to malice or can be adequately described by stupidity. That it would quickly correct itself when the adults came to the room. But no adults arrived, and there's a pattern of behaviour from the current government with control. The first thing they did on coming into power was push The Voice, and The Voice was much about Aboriginal people as the under-16 social media ban is about kids, i.e. nothing to do with them, either of them. Why did Albo spend almost $500 million of taxpayers' money without bipartisan support on trying to get this up when only 8 of 44 referendums in history have ever done so without both sides agreeing? At worst, The Voice would have been a third chamber of government, but at best it would have been a mechanism for a body that permanently influenced, if not totally controlled, by the ALP to frustrate future legislation. Not bad to gamble $500 million of taxpayers' money for ability to permanently influence somehow legislation, because stuff that came through Parliament would have to could optionally go to The Voice. The Voice could make a comment, and the Parliament would have to consider that seriously. By ramping immigration to the moon and distributing housing density across LGAs like they've done, I've shown it's pretty obvious that this has the ability, now whether it's by malice or whether it's just accident, right, to permanently reshape how voting happens in Australia. And you can download the data, run it yourself, check it, form your own opinion, but it looks pretty strange. The third act is to censor dissenters with the hand-in-glove effect of the world-first banning of under-16s from social media, which really should be called the social media track and trace. It's clear it has nothing to do with protecting kids. Sites like Pornhub aren't covered, but instead it's a mechanism to control speech by identifying it and for arbitrarily laying serious fines on platforms. Combined with the misinformation bill, this legislation will set up an Orwellian environment for government control of free speech, and it's the thin end of the wedge for what is going on. It's a national ID card by stealth. It's a security risk if implemented using current KYC techniques because foreign platforms be getting ID and biometrics. But it's clear the direction they're pushing is for everyone to be forced into using something like MyGov, which is now called MyID, for the basis of a surveillance infrastructure. Not only is this a human rights issue and maybe unconstitutional, it will stunt the education, economic development, and maturity of Australian kids. It abrogates parents' rights, and the government is now a co-parent. It is being implemented in an underhanded, deceitful, and undemocratic way. And if you think this is benign, you're gravely mistaken. It wouldn't be rammed through as the 31st piece of legislation beginning at 11 o'clock at night in the Senate, with a debate prevented by guillotine. Only 24 hours allowed for community consultation, where only up to 2 pages of feedback were allowed, and apparently at least 15,000 submissions, reports up to 45,000 were received, but only 105 today have been published. Mine wasn't published. And at the peak, 62,000 people tuned into one live stream. I don't know how many there were, but there was at least one, had 62,000 people on it, to watch the Senate, which is like 400 people in the country, right? To watch one of the greatest miscarriages of lawmaking in Australian history, and talk about destroying faith in democracy. Now, what was the Liberal Party's position on this? You should have been screaming at the top of your lungs, this is not how government should work. What you should have done is put forward a Bill of Rights for the Australian people to protect freedom of speech. And I know John brought freedom of speech here, and that's why I'm here today, because I certainly am an independent thinker. And you would think, and you would win the next election in a landslide if you did that. Instead, what did you do? You went along with it. Talk about snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. And if the Liberal Party does not win the next election or has a very narrow margin, this will be why. This is the biggest policy mistake in the history of the Liberal Party. Not only is there now a consistent track record of your party not sticking to its beliefs, and only Antic, Canavan and Archer had the principle across the floor, but you do realise that if the Liberal Party does not win the next election, and if mass immigration is not immediately stopped, there may not be another chance for you. Should the Liberal Party lose the unlosable election with the current rate of immigration, there'll be 2 million future potential voters entering the country that will likely vote 60-40 one way or another, and most likely that way will be the ALP on a two-party preferred basis, because it'll either be the Greens or the ALP, once naturalised. By supporting the ALP as Orwellian censorship of speech, you've also just alienated 6 million kids. Now, how exactly do you think those kids are going to feel when you forcibly rip their accounts out of their hands and close them? Can you imagine the tantrums that are going to happen when millions of Snapchat and TikTok accounts are turned off? Even Suicide Prevention Australia says this is a bad idea. 1.5 million of those kids will be eligible to vote in the 2028 election, and 1.5 million in the electoral cycle after that. And I guarantee you, they will never forget, and they'll absolutely punish the major parties. So seriously, what on earth were you thinking? You have turned a generation of future voters for the Liberal Party against it. What do you think happens next? Every influencer in the world is about to turn feral on the 2 major Australian parties, and there is nothing you can do to stop that. Every influencer in the world is going to do this because they're losing the viewers. Every kid is going to have a tantrum, and they're going to remember next election and the next election, and they're going to punish you. This is the dumbest political move I've ever seen. And if I was a betting man, Trump will slap a 25% tariff on Australia until the American ideals of free speech and American technology companies are respected. He's already said he's going to do a 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico on his first day in office until they stop the illegal immigrants and fentanyl coming in. And J.D. Vance also said, if NATO wants us to continue to be a good participant in the military alliance, why don't you respect American military values and respect free speech? It is insane that we would support a military alliance if that military alliance is not going to be pro-free speech. So what do you think is going to happen? He's going to slap a tariff on and force you to undo this. You should get ahead of this now. If the Liberal Party is to have a future, I would seriously recommend you huddle and figure out how to do a 180-degree turn real quick. Thank you.